I'm Bob Reyer from the Talking Comics podcast and website, and I've been reading comic books for about 55 years. Now, this starts to sound like the start of another kind of meeting that I'm pledging here, but it's just to say we've been doing this a very, very long time, and they're a passion, and they really are modern mythology in their own way, and a very big part of that is that we need heroes, and always have. And comic book superheroes are now just so much of the cultural landscape, but I'd venture to guess that most people in the general audience aren't really aware of the history of superheroines, despite the fact that their beginnings go all the way back to the start of the medium itself. So by highlighting, particularly some of these characters with long publishing histories, we can see how their portrayal has mirrored the attitudes towards women in American society, and in some cases, how these superwomen may have even moved the conversation forward. So, now, women have always been a part of the comic book industry, whether as characters, some of which have run for decades and decades, as you can see some favorites here, as creators, such as artist Lily Renee Wilhelm, or as readers. Now, from the golden age of comics up, which is 1938, from first Action Comics came out, through about the mid-50s, there's debate as to whether this all ends, female readership was about 50%. That would stay pretty strong until the 1980s. There are some changes in the marketplace, of which we'll talk more about that later, as that went a little haywire. But superheroines were always part of that landscape, too. Now, this is Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, which most people would know from a really, really miserable movie back in the 80s. But in 1937, the United Kingdom, in a magazine called Wags, Sheena, as created by Jerry Iger and comics legend Will Eisner for Fiction House, would actually be the first superhero, predating Superman by 6 months. Because he came out here in June of '38. The book here came out in July of that year. And Sheena was the first superheroine to have her own self-titled book, which ran for many, many years. And this predates a certain Amazon we'll be talking about very, very soon. But Sheena, right at the very beginning. Now, about Fiction House, Planet Comics, where Mr. of the Moon and Gail Allen, and her space helmet there, they were very forward-thinking. They had tons and tons of female creators, artists like Lily Renee, Ruth Atkinson, Fran Hopper, writer Ruth Roach. But and it's something that would come into fruition a little bit later in comics history. There's a problem with their covers about representation of the female form that persists even today. With this one, a fellow named Joe Doolin did, fairly typical of how the covers in these books didn't represent the characters within, or the artwork that would be carried within. And that's, again, a problem that will crop up as we move forward here. In 1941, April 6th to be precise, newspapers across America would feature the debut of the first costumed superheroine, Miss Fury, by Tarpe Mills, who was one of the few female writer-artists of this period. Miss Fury is Marla Drake, clad in a ceremonial panther-skin catsuit, and she would deal out justice to Nazis and various ne'er-do-wells with a sense of individuality and panache that was really, I think, prescient of what would come for superheroines and the role of women in society moving forward. Now, her creator, June Tarpe Mills, chose to use her gender-ambiguous middle name, as she felt that if the kids knew that their favorite heroine was actually written and drawn by a woman, that people would tune out somehow. And yet she ended up becoming as big a star as her creation, and even her cat Perry would end up with her own stories. Miss Fury would be on the noses of airplanes. It was in over 100 newspapers eventually, and Timely Comics, which was Marvel's original name, would reprint Miss Fury in comic book form, and they'd sell over 1 million copies an issue. Right now, sitting over here on the table, comic historian Trina Robbins has curated 2 volumes in hardcover of Miss Fury strips, and they're very much a combination of superheroine and the adventure strips of the time, like Terry and the Pirates and so on. But as you can see, long before there was Catwoman, there was Miss Fury doing the same sort of thing. Around that same time, that same summer, Pocket Comics #1 would print the first stories of the Black Cat, and she was Linda Turner, who was a Hollywood stunt woman turned movie actress who found Nazis on the set. And of course, you know, you got to do something about that. It's not good to have them in the industry. And Phantom Lady, also from the Eisner Iger Studios for Quality Comics. She'd have a run that ran through 4 different companies, and as the years went on, she'd be wearing less and less, and became very infamous for that. And there's a book over there called Seduction of the Innocent we'll deal with later that ran afoul of Dr. Wortham. Now, both these characters are from that summer of 1941, and a little later that year, this group of people would contribute to the heroine that I think more people know than any other. If it's not always for the comic books, but that fellow to the left, that's Dr. William Moulton Marston. He was sort of the Dr. Phil of the 1930s, a world-renowned psychologist, also the creator of the polygraph lie detector. Also created something called disc theory, which is still used in job interviews today, even after 80 years, is to assign people to personalities. There's artist Harry G. Peter, editor Sheldon Meyer, and Max Gaines of All American Comics, who, to most people's opinion, mine included, is actually the father of modern comic books. He was the first person to fold tabloid newspaper comic strips in half again and create that book that we all know as a comic book. Well, Dr. Marston wrote an article, Why People Shouldn't Laugh at the Comics, and described what he thought of as the bloodthirsty masculinity of male superheroes. And that letter and that article came to the attention of Max Gaines, and Dr. Marston went into the office and they discussed sort of this. And along with Sheldon Meyer, comic book superheroes changed a little bit. At that point, Batman still carried a gun and shot people. Superman threw bad guys out windows and through walls. And because of what Dr. Marston had to say about these characters and children, they backed away from that. Mr. Gaines, father of William Gaines, who'd found Mad Magazine and the EC Horror Comics, said, well, Doc, you're so smart, what do you have? Do you have any ideas for us? Well, Dr. Marston, along with Harry Peter, did come up with an idea. And along with his wife, Elizabeth, who said it must be a woman, decided that what we needed to have was a character who was as strong as Superman, but still beautiful, and who could be an aspirational figure for young girls. And along with that, since Dr. Marston was a firm believer in the superiority of women over men, he was convinced that in 100 years there'd be a matriarchy because a woman's strength was as great as a man, but because leavened by compassion would put us all in a better place. So that would end up with a text story in a short story in All-Star Comics 8, the home of the Justice Society. And at the cover date of December 1941, told a little bit of the story everyone knows, Steve Trevor crashing on the island and Paradise Island, you know, the home of the Amazons. Now, Dr. Marston's Amazons were not those of Greek myth. They were pulled back from the violence a little bit. They were healers. They had technology. And they were just a utopian society who didn't retreat from man's world because of hatred, but just they didn't need men anymore. They had something else to do. Very soon after, you'd have Sensation Comics #1, and then her own, 6 months later, her own quarterly Wonder Woman book, and each one would sell over 2.5 million copies a month. Now, Wonder Woman's origin is much different than most others. Most superheroes have come to fruition because of violence or vengeance or their planet explodes. But in the case of Wonder Woman, her mother, the Queen, yearned to have a daughter and prayed to the goddess Athena, who gave her the wisdom to create a little clay statue. Aphrodite breathes life into her, and Wonder Woman is born out of a magic clay and a mother's desire to have a daughter. So instead of someone's parents get shot, the Nazis attack, something horrible happens, it's all about love. And it is so much different. And that's something that would inform this character through all of Dr. Marston's run on the book. Now, there were real women in Wonder Woman's life. That is Dr. Marston to the right. That is his wife, Sadie Elizabeth Holloway. Joy Murchison, then to her right, who was Dr. Marston's writing assistant, who would take over a lot of the writing of the book when he contracted polio. And Olive Byrne, who's wearing rather large bracelets. And she was Dr. Marston's assistant. And those bracelets and her curly hair became expressed in the Wonder Woman character itself. Now, there are other characters around at that point. This is for Timely, or Marvel. This is their Miss America, created by Otto Binder and a Disney animator named Pauline Loth. Now, that first issue was a comic. It then went to a magazine size, which had all sorts of tips and so on, and sort of that may be the first evidence of cosplay ever, right? There is this young woman dressed as Miss America. That second issue also featured, for those really into comic books, the first appearance of Patsy Walker, also by Otto Binder and drawn by Ruth Atkinson. We will get back to Wonder Woman, by the way. Don't fret. There's a lot more of Wonder Woman. She's one of those people who, because of the 75 years, it is her anniversary year, so much has happened in society and in her book that we'll get to trace that all through her history. Now, after the war, as our Rosie the Riveter, just as these Rosies were moved out of the job market, so were super-heroines, and most of the female creators were too, as really a trend toward feminine domesticity began to creep into the American zeitgeist as well. And that's a trend that through what would happen to Wonder Woman, because after Dr. Marston's death in 1947, despite lobbying by his wife and Joy Murchison and some other highly placed people, editor Robert Kanigher took over and basically weakened his creation, downplaying her self-reliance, her positive messages, and it became a romance book. Despite the title of sensation, it was now, what letters to the forlorn could Diana answer? Or how could Steve and she get together? And it just, you really lost their way. Now, there was something worse, though. A bigger cloud was on the horizon for comics in the form of this book. So actually, this is by Dr. Frederick Wertham, who was a psychiatrist from New York, who felt that comic books were the bane of everyone's existence. They were the cause of juvenile delinquency, that Superman was a fascist and Batman was as much a criminal as those he put away. And he had a particular problem with Wonder Woman, who he blamed for basically everything but the Chicago fire and the San Francisco earthquake. To him, a nation of all ladies, there was something terribly wrong with that a woman should have such power and self-reliance. It seemed wrong to him. And even though he was trying to do the right thing by children, there was something very blunderbuss in his entire approach, and she basically threw out the baby with the bathwater. And by the time he got done, the comic book publishers were running in such fear, they created the Comics Code Authority to make sure that nothing bad would ever appear in a comic book again. For instance, you could not now say crime, terror, horror, or anything else bad on a cover. Criminals all had to be punished. No weaponry was allowed. Also, you went from a medium that, coming out of the Second World War, where comics were in every GI's care package. There were books for adults, and those books for adults were now thought of as awful because children might read them, as opposed to, well, there's children's and adult things they can do together. There's guidance adults can provide for children, but no, we just jumped all over, canceled everything. Very few superheroines or superheroes in general managed to last through the war, the post-war period. So then we end up in sort of the safe Eisenhower 50s. Everything, now any character that was going to come about seemed to be knocked off of the male lead. So in this case, this is the original Batwoman, Kate Kane. It's her first appearance in 1956. Now, these sort of safe comics also telling about what writers and editors thought about what a woman's role would be, because Batwoman, instead of fighting crime as Batman and Robin did, well, she fought crime with a powder puff that put out sort of sneezing powder. She had an exploding hairnet that would drop over criminals, and they all pulled from her utility purse. Now, Supergirl, who we all sort of know, the new television show is out, debuted in this issue of Action Comics in 1959. And well, certainly Supergirl shares Superman's origin in a way. She's from Krypton, has all the powers he has, certainly as powerful, strength-wise, flying, heat vision, all the rest. He kept her as the secret weapon, kept her hidden. And at one point in an issue in late 1959, because she exposed her secret identity, he exiled her into space for a year. She told her secret identity to Crypto the Superdog. Really? A year in space for talking to a dog. That's where we were at. And it would take a long time until things got better. In 1960, though, Wonder Woman, whose book was still published continually through this period, becomes part of the new Justice League, along with Flash and the Martian Manhunter, Green Lantern, and Aquaman. Now, in this case, she is much better served in these Justice League books, where I, as a young boy, discovered her adventures. Still had her lasso, the invisible jet, all those things were going on, and she was rather solid character. First I had seen as a female hero. She's much better served here than Mr. Kanigher was still on the Wonder Woman book, because over there, she was more inclined to be worried about romantic entanglements with Amoeba Man and Merman, or whether Steve was going to propose to her every issue, marrying space aliens. There was something quite missing for this character. Again, we'll go through some periods with Wonder Woman. She'll be back in this discussion in a little bit. But this was as bad as things could get for this character at this point. All those things that were put into place by Dr. Marston 15 years before had all gone by the wayside. But comics were about to change as the Silver Age really began with the publication of this in the summer of '61. It's Fantastic Four #1 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, where they were looking to, if not books for 9-year-olds, wanted to look for slightly older audience, right? A book that everyone could enjoy at multiple levels. In this team, for those who know, it's the Thing, Mr. Fantastic, the Human Torch, and the Invisible Girl. That's its own telling clue, I guess. Stan and Jack did want to make her a major part of the team, but as comics historian Trina Robbins points out, Sue's powers are very Victorian. She turns invisible and hides when there's trouble. She was constantly becoming a hostage. If she used her powers too long, she'd faint away from exhaustion and just collapse on the floor. Now, this, as you can see here right away, she does save the day in #5 there. She actually beats Dr. Doom. But the real problem is it took many years for this to begin to change. Now, they would, Stan and Jack, would make Sue Storm, Susan Richards, who would be the first super-heroine wife and mother just a few years later in annual #6. But it would take another 10 years for a creator to really see the potential in this character and do something better with it than just the sort of token girl on the team. And here's a character we all know. It's Detective number 359. It's Gardner Fox and Carmine Infantry who create Batgirl. And it's librarian Barbara Gordon, the daughter of the police commissioner. And she was every bit as good a detective as Batman was. She had her own backup series in Detective that ran many, many years. She's had her own travails as the years have gone on. But in this period, it was only a couple of months later, because that September, Yvonne Craig would become Batgirl for the 3rd season of the Batman television show. And it's probably the most remembered thing about that entire season. There wasn't much, but there was Yvonne Craig. Around that same time, over on Wonder Woman, Denny O'Neil, pretty early in his writing career, but he would decide that he could make a statement about female empowerment by depowering Wonder Woman. That instead of her having the gifts from the gods and the Amazons, that if she was self-reliant enough to get these skills and learn how to do karate and be a fighter hand-to-hand, that this would bring more to women, that they'd feel more connected to her. But honestly, if we want to watch a karate-kicking spy, if that's what we wanted, we would just watch Emma Peel on The Avengers, and didn't want a Wonder Woman doing karate or pining away after Steve, let alone with an old man mentor, or firing off automatic weapons at her foes. More readers found this insulting than uplifting, frankly. And it's one of those things where they were not ahead of what was going on in the world. The women's liberation movement was in beginnings, but really starting to capture the public interest. Over at Marvel, writer Roy Thomas, artist John Buscema, in a rather heavy-handed way, tried to address this with this issue with the introduction of the Valkyrie, who will be in the next Thor movie. It's the Valkyrie and her Lady Liberators. Now, again, very heavy-handed, but what we have here is a team of female Avengers, the Scarlet Witch, the Wasp, Black Widow, and Medusa, who brought together Take Down the Avengers. And as I was 14 when this came out, and this hit me in a way that very few things did. It was a team of superwomen who were every bit as powerful and in control as any team of men. That they could beat the mighty Avengers hit me as, I need to read more superwomen. There's more of this that I need to be seeing what's going on. Again, issue is a little tough to read now. When we did for our website, I did a retro review trying to review this if I was still 14 and then coming back again. But it's certainly worth checking out. Now, speaking of the women's lib movement, around the same time as that that Avengers issue rather, Ms. Magazine, this is from 1972. That's the first cover With Wonder Woman for president, I'll tell you, if she was running this year, I would take her as my choice over the people who are running. Covers by Murphy Anderson. That's their 40th anniversary issue where they brought her back again. That covers by Michael and Laura Allred. The founder of Ms. Magazine, Gloria Steinem, when she was preparing that cover, started going through the Wonder Woman books and discovered that DC had depowered Wonder Woman. She was now not the Wonder Woman she had grown up with. And with some of her fellows on the magazine went up to DC and said, you need to fix this. There's got to be a way that you can give Wonder Woman back her gifts and she can be the character that all of us aspired to be all these years ago and still do even after 30-odd years. DC agreed and actually did that. That book you see to the right, actually I have a copy here. In 1972, Ms. Magazine published the first collection of Golden Age Wonder Woman stories. It hadn't been seen in 30 years. They're split into various sections about sisterhood and so on. And now that you can actually buy some of these stories, it's a little different, but the first time I saw this, it was the same sort of feeling I had seeing that Avengers book. It was, there's something else to this character. She is not fighting over whether she should marry a space alien or an amoeba. It was a story about sisterhood and the strength of women, and that was very, very special. Wonder Woman was repowered right after that in 1973, but what this move couldn't do was start to reverse the trend that saw female readers drifting away from superhero comic books. All through the 50s and 60s, these comics were horror, westerns, romances, kid books, funny animals, and the publishers had gone away from that. They were still out there, but it was becoming all superheroes all the time. And they were just increasingly male-centric power fantasies, with an occasional exception. And so women were starting to drift away from books, but they still loved these characters because 75 saw the premiere of Wonder Woman, which is how I think most people still remember this character. And certainly not a bad way to see it. If there's a perfect bit of casting for a superheroine or a superhero in general, it is Linda Carter as this character, the first season particularly, which is done as a World War II period piece. It is absolutely what Dr. Marston had written, and those values are all there. And she will be back, apparently, as the President of the United States in the next season of Supergirl, which is coming soon, so that was pretty special. Also, in this period at Marvel, they debuted the new X-Men in this giant-size issue, #1. And this is Len Wein, but thanks to Chris Claremont, who'd taken the book over fairly shortly, they were just a hotbed for solidly written superheroines, whether it was Kitty a little bit later on. Certainly Jean Grey and Storm, and it's just one of the biggest sellers of the period, selling upwards of 450,000 copies a month. When you know that today there's an event here and there that'll sell it, the biggest selling book sells about 100,000 copies. And this book, even into the mid-'80s, was selling nearly 500,000 copies. And this is even after things got very spotty due to all these nothing but superhero books. And then there's also the creation of the direct market, which we all know that's how you buy comics. Now you go into a comic book store. In the old days, comic books were available at every corner newsstand, every stationery store, the 7-Elevens. They were a mass market product, and in a way to find new readership, the comic book industry lost their old readership. And that particularly included young girls and women who were not comfortable walking into these very often dirty, very often screaming, yelling, stereotypical places that we think of as the comic book guy. And that has changed now because with books available in so many other formats, books are beginning to sell that didn't before. We can't even know those figures now because of digital sales. But books like this that sold 450,000 copies, it's because they were just available everywhere. So we need to find a way back to that, though I don't think it ever will somehow. Sort of finishing up into the 70s, we have the introduction of Ms. Marvel in 1977. Jerry Conway and then Chris Claremont would take over this one. Carol Danvers had originally been a supporting character for Captain Marvel when that was reintroduced in 1968. And she now has acquired some portion of his powers. And so she's part Kree, part human. She was an Air Force officer, NASA agent, sort of a spy, depending on how many different backstories. Comic book characters have so many of them. At this point, though, she is the editor of Woman magazine for J. Jonah Jameson of the Daily Bugle. And this would run for about 2 years, but create sort of an impact. People love this character and Carol as this character. So we'll hear more about her later, too. Now, as we start to move into the 80s, there's a beginning of what I feel is kind of a backlash against superheroes and superheroines more particularly in general, because as there were some high points through this period, certainly through the X-Men here, the changing dynamics of this marketplace, more adult storytelling, really start to take a toll and begin to even drive the female readership down even further. Now, Carol was now an Avenger as Ms. Marvel. They changed her outfit a little later in the 70s and the early 80s. Dave Cockrum loved that sort of swimsuit look. He did that to Storm and a few other people. In this issue, which is certainly one of the, I shouldn't use absolutes, but I'm going to. It's one of the worst comic book issues ever. And I'll just leave it at that. Carol Danvers, who's an Avenger in great standing, ends up with child from her own son from some other dimension. The Avengers actually let her go away with her abuser at the end of the issue. Now, a year later, Chris Claremont wrote an Avengers annual and tried to fix all of this. But that fix didn't stay either, because again, here's a character, she's Ms. Marvel, on the cover of that first issue, liberated heroine, so on and so forth. Other writers would make her an alcoholic, depower her twice, drum her out of the Avengers on a court-martial. And it would take, as with some of the other characters, take some time for that to be rectified. But it's a period here where all those gains of the 70s are beginning to be eroded away by, one thinks is not editorial caveat. There isn't an agenda, but you can start to piece one together almost. And it's sad to think, maybe it's just too many men writing these books and not enough ladies. At this point in time, there were 2 women drawing comic books, one at each company, Marie Severin for Marvel, Ramona Fraden over at DC, and that was about it. Things would change, as I mentioned, for Sue Storm in 1981. John Byrne would take over the Fantastic Four as writer-artist, and he was determined to make Susan Storm the most powerful member of the team. So he would increase her role as leader here and there, increase her power set, that she now use them for offense as well as defense. She sort of levitate using her visible force fields. And though Mr. Byrne would visit some grief upon her, including this issue 280, 284 here, where she's prisoner of the Psycho Man. There's a name for a villain, right? He can be Dr. Doom or all these evil things, Psycho Man. But through her travail, she would triumph over him really without the help of her teammates. She decided she needed to be the Invisible Woman at this point. And those gains on Sue's behalf would stay for a very, very long time, even though he would be off the book fairly soon. And the thing is, while there were positives in this period, for every gain, it seems like there's a major loss. So in the Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1985, it was decided that Supergirl, you didn't need more than one survivor of Krypton. So they chose, she sacrificed herself to help save the multiverse, which didn't end up being saved anyway. And that would be the end of Supergirl for a while. Thing is, then we turn that around. That crisis would allow George Perez to revitalize Wonder Woman with this February 1987 #1 issue, and just a glorious cover. Mr. Perez, still thought of as the gold standard, and rightly so, an emphasis on the mythology, mixing it with some of his own thoughts and Dr. Marston's restoration of his idea of the Amazons, with the addition of the Amazons are now the souls of women murdered. So you carrying into play the idea of a woman's love is now they're a society of people who need each other and support each other constantly. So if you get a chance, they've just put out a lovely omnibus that is about 14 pounds of Wonder Woman stories. It's the first 25 issues of George Perez's run, and they promised to do the rest. He would do through 62 on that. Speaking of negatives, oh boy. This is a very famous comic book story by Alan Moore, who's the creator of The Watchmen and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and a number of other things. It's time and a place for a discussion about Mr. Moore and his feelings about women, which seem, I shouldn't presume to say what Mr. Moore thinks, but here we have an issue where it's Batman and the Joker and doing their usual dance. In this issue, it's become very famous, infamous, more properly, where the Joker shoots Barbara Gordon. She ends up disabled. As per the artist, even worse. Barbara is only a plot point. No one pays any attention to her after her being wounded. She's sort of left to the side. She advances the Joker story and Batman story, but she's no part of this story at all. This issue might be the tipping point into the grim and gritty era that would come in the 90s. There was certainly the Wolverine came out before this and was moving into that direction. The Punisher had come out and a few other things. But this might be where you took a character that people loved and just turned it on its head for the sake of being shocking. And just what would happen, though, from this, Kim Yale and John Ostrander thought this was just a horrible thing to do. So in their book, Suicide Squad, now known for the movie that just came out, they would decide that Barbara Gordon was too good a character to waste forever. So as she was a great detective and a fabulous computer person, they would reveal her to be Oracle, who was the computer hacker supreme of the DC Universe, the information broker for Batman and all the other heroes. And in that vein, she would continue as a character, probably as Oracle, even better than she was as Batgirl. Now, that tipping point into the 90s would go completely off the rails as Image Comics would form in 1992 with artists Jim Lee, Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Mark Silvestri, Jim Valentino, Eric Larson, who all worked at Marvel in this increasingly sort of objectifying house style, posed oddly, pneumatic ladies, just completely objectifying. And I just don't think it's coincidental that this would lead to even greater excesses at other companies, and these excesses would infect the entire industry, the big two included, because Marvel would put out ridiculous stuff like swimsuit issues, and even the most upstanding superheroines weren't immune either, because fairly soon you'd see Wonder Woman and Sue Storm dressed as if they should be on the cover of some sort of a fetish magazine. That quote from Mike Deodato, who drew that Wonder Woman issue, it's sadly emblematic of this entire era, and it's a problem that continues to go on. At this point, Trina Robbins, who I mentioned before, comic book historian and creator, was trying to pitch a new Wonder Woman book to DC. And their response to her was she wanted to do an all-ages book. Well, girls don't read comics. Well, Trina's response was, well, not when they're insulting to us, we don't. And you wonder why comic book readership in general is falling away at this point, except for an occasional oddball spot of Superman dies and everyone has to go buy this issue, or it's on the news all of a sudden because it's a slow news day and let's go have some fun and sell some comic books to the kids. But you flushed away what was historically half of the readership of comic books through nonsense like this. Now, things that almost get worse because by the time we get here, and it's Green Lantern 54, the flickering flame of the noble superhero would nearly be extinguished by here, and that plight would be highlighted by the tumult over this issue. It's Green Lantern 54, where Kyle Rayner's girlfriend is murdered by a character called Major Force and stuffed into his refrigerator so he can find her. She's nothing but a plot device as opposed to a human being or a character. And if we're supposed to care about these people, those traits are so important. Now, the good thing about this is this would prompt fan, critic, and future comic books writer Gail Simone to create Women in Refrigerators, a website that would list all the terrible things done to the major superheroines and the supporting characters, just to point out how ridiculous this had all become, as these characters are now not treated as characters, but instead as a cardboard figure to move around a game board at a whim. Now, in that period, just after, Chuck Dixon would take what Kim Yale and John Ostrander do and take Barbara Gordon's Oracle character, team her up with the Black Canary, with the Huntress, to create the Birds of Prey, which short-run TV show, and some characters that we will see again later on. And eventually, Gail Simone would take over this book, and this is a panel from issue number 108 with, I should say, 4-page spread. You have to buy 2 copies of the book to actually see all the heroines here. Ms. Simone's Birds of Prey features some of the strongest superhero and superheroine presentations ever. It's a book that can still be revisited now after all this time, after nearly 15 years, and still be a solid, solid book and a great place to start. And they've just begun to reprint these finally after them being out of print for a very long time. So you might ask Rebecca here at the library to begin getting some Birds of Prey in. Major highlight of this really dark period is What If 105 with the amazing Spider-Girl. She is May Parker, is the daughter of Peter and Mary Jane in an alternate future. And though most people don't know it, she is Marvel's longest-running solo female character. Ran for over 150 issues in various configurations, digest size, digital books. And Marvel, for some reason, has none of these in print. They can be found. They're on Amazon. They're second sellers. You go through a junk shop. They're on there for 50 cents on a dollar. It's a fabulous character, very much the way her father's book was. It's about high school and a girl growing up. Very much the way Buffy the Vampire Slayer would be. You get to see the two worlds, her superhero world as well as her life in school. And so if you get a chance to catch up to Spider-Girl, you definitely should. Now, considering all else that was going on, these are very, very dark times, despite that. Heroes fighting heroes, if you can even tell which ones were which. Dark and objectifying artwork that even here through the 2000s would rival what was going back into the 90s. And this is a trend that would eventually lead to the creation of this fabulous little initiative, the Hawkeye Initiative, who decided that, you know, if you're going to continually show the ladies in these sort of poses that make no sense, called the Brokeback pose, or the Escher girl for that Escher staircase that spirals around like the DNA molecule. Well, what if we drew the men to look like this and pose them in these ridiculous outfits? And if you go, they're still finding new artwork to put here. And these sort of things, I think it finally began to make the case for people. Because this sort of artwork, what you would have, and whether it's even, when you look at these sort of things, if you see the way the men are posed, and what are highlighted in the male physique, it is those attributes that display power and aggression and a certain status. And the highlighted areas on these female characters, when you're saying, oh, they're all just pinups, no, the men are displayed as strong, and it's the women who are now chosen to pose as if they're swimsuit models in ways that expose their vulnerability, or it's about their sexual objectivity. So these dark periods, as with everything else, as in the real world, I think the Dark Ages were followed by a Renaissance, which I actually highlighted ahead one, which was a mistake, but what that. I believe began with the publication of this, Captain Marvel #1 in 2012 by writer Kelly Sue DeConnick, who she just reimagined this character who had been multi-fridged, if there is such a verb, having all those bad things visited upon her. She had taken up the mantle of Captain Marvel, who is now deceased, at the insistence of Captain America. He said, you earned this. And so she does. And that's Kelly Sue there with two young ladies, one dressed as Captain Marvel. Kelly Sue DeConnick did not skimp on superhuman action, but as what she brought to Carol's personality. She showed us her ability to overcome the things life and other writers threw into her path, as well as never failing to show us her humanity, such as her dealings with her supporting cast. That's Kit Lieutenant Trouble there, taking a nice little flight. And it's this perfect blend that endeared her to readers. And for some of them, Captain Marvel was their first comic book. Now, an army of readers, new and old, grew around Ms. DeConnick's Captain Marvel, some of whom formed this fan collective, the Carol Corps. I see a Carol Corps shirt in the audience, right there. And as you can see, Carol loves punching dinosaurs, and that young lady to the right there brought her own dinosaur to a New York Comic-Con, which they then sit around for people to just punch. That lady is also a physicist, by the way, and she just does this for fun. That positive energy was felt completely throughout fandom and into Marvel's offices themselves. So along with editor Sana Amanat and artist Jamie McKelvey, writer G. Willow Wilson created the new Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, in 2014. Now, the new Ms. Marvel is a high schooler. She's a Pakistani American from Jersey City who is a big fan of Captain Marvel. So to my knowledge, Kamala Khan is probably the first legacy heroine from a female root. We've had Batgirls and Batwomen and Supergirls and all those sorts of things. This is the first time that someone came directly from another female hero. Now, this book was an instant success with fans and critics. It's charming yet deep as we deal with Kamala's trying to do the school thing that Peter Parker did as Spider-Man, dealing with her rather strict parents who wanted to honor their religion, their upbringing as well. This won tons of awards in and out of comics as a very socially aware book, as well as just a great comic book, and all just rightly so. That young lady to the right there, I saw her at a New York Comic-Con as well. The first year that Ms. Marvel was out, there were already cosplayers for this book, and again, well deservedly so. Now, even while their major books tread a much different path. There's still heroes fighting heroes, lots of crazy stuff going on at Marvel. They continue to go down a lighter road, as they did with Kamala, with new or reimagined superheroines, such as Spider-Gwen, who is Gwen Stacy's, Peter's first girlfriend, who has now acquired spider powers the same way he did. We have the unbeatable Squirrel Girl, who we have her first volume right over there, who actually has the power to talk to squirrels, which sounds like, well, that's just ridiculous. Well, Squirrel Girl, in her first appearance, beats Doctor Doom, the Fantastic Four's major villain. She's actually taken out Galactus and Thanos, and all the while, it's all in great fun. She's a regular person who dreams of being a superheroine, as you can see there, and she's achieved that dream. It's a staggeringly great little book, tons of positive messages, and you just can't imagine a loopier book than this, when the entire thing, the entire front page is always filled with tweets from Tony Stark as they argue back and forth when she steals the armor to fly into space, including one for her pet squirrel, Tippy. You haven't lived till you've seen a squirrel in an Iron Man armor, is all I'm going to say. We also had Dr. Jane Foster pick up Mjolnir and become the new goddess of thunder. As a spectacular wraparound cover by Russell Dowderman. This book was launched to a great fanfare on The View, and took some time for some people to get used to. There's still some backlash. People would rather see the other guy with the hammer. But this book is outselling the male version of Thor by about 20,000 copies, by about 30% over what the other book was selling. And that was a critically acclaimed, great comic book. But there's an audience for this. And Marvel has realized it and moved ahead with this. Now, at DC, they're not too slow on the uptake, so their editor, Mark Doyle, who's part of the Bat Group, decided to take his part of the Dark Knight's universe into the daylight by reimagining Barbara Gordon slightly younger, moving her out of Gotham City into grad school, so she's now the Batgirl of Burnside, with her brand new outfit, which includes, you can't see it in that picture, a pair of yellow Doc Martens. Within the first month of the new Batgirl book, the Doc Marten company ran out of yellow Doc Martens as people went crazy trying to cosplay as the new Batgirl. If you go to a con now, you just see tons and tons of this. Again, it plays up her detective abilities, plays up her intelligence, and those are the things that now resonate with a different set of readers. And Gotham Academy, which is sort of a cross between Scooby-Doo, Buffy, and the craziest horror book you've ever read, and Batman, as the girls and boys of Gotham Academy fight mysteries and guest stars. These books have touched a chord with people. They sell now in different marketplaces. Yes, the books sell, and fairly well, but they sell as trade paperbacks in Barnes & Nobles, at Amazon, digital copies online through Comixology and the various formats. For those people who don't want to go to that comic store, that dingy place at the corner of your block, there's, I used to go in there, but I can't anymore. There are now other ways to get these books. So these are the sort of things that are selling now across the board, and the companies have finally caught on. Smaller publishers would jump on board here too, as we get charming superhero-y titles such as Paul Tobin and Colin Coover's Bandette, Faith Erin Hicks's Adventures of Super-Hero Girl. There's certainly for younger readers, but older ones such as me, and I'm about the oldest person in this room, I get plenty of joy out of these books. You have adult science fiction, as with Saga, Brian K. Vaughan, Fiona Staples, or the wonderful all-ages sort of flipped fairy tale Princess by Jeremy Whitley. She's a princess stuck in a tower, and she doesn't want to be there. She rescues herself, along with the help of her pet dragon, Sparky, goes around to rescue the rest of her sisters. And there's a volume right over here of Princess as well. Again, both very, very award-winning books for two different marketplaces. But again, that is the point. We have for grown-ups, for children, for teenagers, and these characters speak to everyone. At the recent San Diego Comic Book Convention, Lunella Lafayette, who is Moon Girl, the star of the book Moon Girl and Devil Dinosaur, which you see on her shirt there, has now been announced to be the smartest person in the Marvel Universe. She's passed Tony Stark and Henry Pym, Reed Richards, Dr. Doom, a whole bunch of them, and she's a 9-year-old kid from the Lower East Side. And that's the cover of number 13, which is coming out soon. Now, things are certainly getting better. As you can see, there are positives and negatives to this. Problem being, there is still that yin and yang to how this all works. So we've been told that female-led superhero movies aren't going to make any money because they've bombed before. Well, they made terrible ones. They made Catwoman and Elektra, And they don't stop and think, well, female-led action movies like Terminator 2 or Fury Road or Aliens make plenty of money and are critically acclaimed and make everyone happy. And then we're told, well, Wonder Woman is tricky, and how do you film that, or how do you make that happen? Well, thankfully, in 2017, we'll have a Wonder Woman film, and directed by Patty Jenkins. And Gal Gadot, who plays Wonder Woman, is certainly the best thing in the recent Batman versus Superman film. Trailer looks very interesting. It's still early. We can't know. We know it for a year, but they made a Wonder Woman movie, and it's going to happen. We also have a brand new Wonder Woman series taking up from where some things went into some bad places for Wonder Woman, but we now have Greg Rucka, who did a wonderful run in the early 2000s, and he's writing this book that takes Wonder Woman back to her origins in #2 and #1. It's alternating by Liam Sharp and Nicola Scott on the artwork, which restores, it seems like, much of what Dr. Marston had in mind, as well as some of the writers who've done good work in between. So Wonder Woman in print and in film now looking to be more of her on-model self. Now, we have a Supergirl television show. Stories as the show was winding down, well, the ratings on the last episode fell terribly. And particularly from the first issue, after 20 issues, the ratings were way down. Well, what they buried deep in that story is, yes, Supergirl's ratings fell from issue 21, I'm showing my bias, from episode 21 to episode 22. But episode 22's ratings were higher than the show it was up against, Gotham. But that wasn't the headline. Supergirl beats Gotham in the ratings, the show that Fox is spending lots of money on and promoting like mad. But that somehow goes by the wayside. Now, season 2 is coming, and it will be on the CW this time around, and they promise even more superhero action. And the first season comes out tomorrow on Blu-ray and DVD. I sound like I work for Best Buy, but no, I don't. But you should definitely check into Supergirl if you get the chance. It's just a lovely, lovely show. Back to this. DC has decided to make their first R-rated animated feature and use The Killing Joke as the linchpin for this new set of adult stories. Problem is there wasn't enough story in The Killing Joke. So they expanded it, and they tried to do what they thought was the right thing by expanding Barbara Gordon's story and make her a character that people could identify with. So they gave her a backstory that then made her a very ineffectual superheroine who gets beaten up by just her regular crooks, goes and hides, ends up in a relationship with Batman, which is so creepy because he's her mentor and she's a teenage girl. And I don't know how you could make The Killing Joke worse, but they found a way to do it. But here's the thing, there is that. But there are very strong rumors that Barbara Gordon, as Oracle, will be appearing in the second season of Supergirl, and with the Huntress brought along with her. So we're going to see the Birds of Prey, it looks like, as part of Supergirl. So we have one, but then we have the other. Marvel Studios may have been lagging behind in getting a Wasp movie or a Black Widow movie together. But they managed to sign Oscar winner Brie Larson to be Carol Danvers in the Captain Marvel movie. There's not her in a costume. Someone came up with that, and it's been all online, and I think it looks pretty great. Ms. Larson tweeted out pictures today of her wearing a Captain Marvel sweater, laying on her couch, reading the trade paperbacks of Captain Marvel to prepare for this movie. So I think they've found a way to overcome what they didn't do right before, and they're going to do it again here. There is a Ant-Man and the Wasp movie coming, so that too, but that's a little ways away yet, or her having a solo movie. Now, just in closing, by the way, that is a picture from the very late 40s. As you can see, young ladies are always reading comic books even then, and the choice of the young lady on the left I'm very happy with. Now, the broad range of topics, themes, and tones in modern comic books with some of these newer superheroines, it just opens up the world of comics to fans of all these other genres across the literary and filmic spectrums. And it really could signal the start of another golden age of comics, in that we have these other genres again. We have horror books and westerns and romances, and Squirrel Girl counts as a funny animal book. It can appeal to all audiences and all ages. And so the variety and quality of these books and the positive nature of some of this female representation we're beginning to see, we've hopefully returned to the equilibrium of this medium's beginnings. And we're going to see more respectful, balanced, and diverse presentations of these female characters that will more reflect the world at large. And once again, superheroines will be the figures that everyone can look up to, no matter the particulars of the reader, gender, age, or anything else. Now, There was a poll recently printed in Comics Beat in 2014. It was a Facebook poll of self-identified comic book fans. And of those people who self-identified themselves as such, 46.7% of them were female. This is not a number that would have been the case even when DC relaunched their New 52 5 years ago. Their readership was about 3% women. So just over the last couple of years, through some of these positive changes, there's been a difference. And the difference can be thought of in the new way books can be delivered, as well as some of these new characters and more attention to detail. Mr. Rucker recently basically fired an artist doing one of the covers because he just didn't care for the representation of Wonder Woman on a cover. So it's about these creators too, as well as we as readers needing to be more selective in what we buy, to pick those books that are the things that we'd want our daughters and wives and sisters to read, or who they'd like to be as people, who we'd like to see them as people. And so the one thing, on that note, something I'd like to close with is this. This is from Captain Marvel #1. Have you ever seen a little girl run so fast she falls down? There's an instant, a fraction of a second before the world catches hold of her again. A moment when she's outrun every doubt and fear she's ever had about herself, and she flies. And that one moment, every little girl flies. Let's be the people, to the young ladies around us, who help that happen, who make them fly. Thank you very much.